Yeah, so like I said, I'm going to go through a real quick crash course on a 5-minute talk on the QPOINT, followed by a 5-minute talk on the QSOURCE. And hopefully we'll still have like 2 to 3 minutes at the end for me to answer any questions that you have. Please post them in the comments. Feel free to ask me anything about these two products. I'll do my best to answer your questions, all right? So yeah, so let's go ahead and start. So let me flip the camera over here. Welcome to my home. This is my humble system, or part of it. And like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about the QSOURCE and the QPOINT. So let's start over here with the QSOURCE. Okay, this is the QSOURCE over here. The QPOINT, I'm sorry. This is the QPOINT over here. So pretty little thing. So the QPOINT is a resonance synchronizer. To understand a little bit better what it does, let me go back to me. To understand a little bit better what it does, let's talk about synchronization for a moment. So synchronization is a natural phenomenon that happens to a lot of natural and also man-made objects. So I think by far the best example is the metronome example. So if you have a set of metronomes on a table, and you start them at random times, they will eventually synchronize all by themselves. So what we're trying to do here with the QPOINT is replicate or translate that effect into our systems. Okay, so let's go back to the QPOINT over here. So you can see that the top, we have this top plate, we call it a top dispersion plate. So what we're doing here is we're generating a very, very weak field inside the QPOINT. And that field, in fact, is so weak that it can only travel about 20 centimeters or 8 inches above this black plate. Okay? So the QPOINT needs to be in the immediate vicinity of the device that you're trying to influence with it. Right? And that field contains a pattern. And that pattern is what the movement of the charges inside my device is going to sync to. Okay, that's the way that we did that translation. We replicated that behavior, that natural behavior of synchronization in our system. Okay, so exploring the QPOINT a little bit more. You can see right here that there's a flip switch. Okay, and there are two numbers right over there. So there's 1 on the bottom and 2 on the top. If I flip the switch down, I'm on number 1, and I'm going to get a blue light in the front of the QPOINT. If I go back here and flip the switch to number 2, I'm going to get a green light in the front. So you know just by looking at the LED in the front what the setting of the switch on the back is. And what does that switch do? Well, that switch actually sets a mode. Remember that I said that we created patterns inside the QPOINT that go out through that field. So by selecting modes 1 or 2, you're actually selecting one of those patterns for the charges to sync to. Now, we listened to over 100 of those patterns, okay? And we chose these two because we think these two really make a difference. So, but you're absolutely free to choose from them. Now, we have a few recommendations. First of all, depending on what kind of music you're listening to, you're probably going to like mode 1 or mode 2 better. Mode 1 being the blue and mode 2 being the green one. So for example, if you listen to a lot of acoustic stuff, classic, jazz, stuff like that, you're probably going to like mode 1, the blue mode, a little bit better. Because the blue mode has this extra background noise reduction. So it's really, really dark in the background there. So you get a lot of soundstage. Conversely, if you're more into rock or pop, more rhythmic stuff, you might like mode 2, the green mode, a little bit better, right? It's more engaging in that sense. Now, it also depends on what device you're pairing the QPOINT with. So if you're pairing it with a very digital device, notice the quotes, please. So like a CD player or a transport or a DAC or a music server, you might like mode 1, the blue mode, also a little bit better. Okay, conversely again, if you're using it with a more analog device like an amp or a preamp, you're probably going to like mode 2 better. But you're absolutely free to experiment with those, and we encourage that. Okay, and we also love to hear feedback on that. Okay, so one last thing that I wanted to tell you about the QPOINT. It comes with its own power supply and this little mat. Why do we ship a mat with it? Well, notice I showed you before here, the QPOINT should be positioned, as I said, as close as possible to the device that I want it to influence. So I have basically two options. I can either slide it or I can rest it on top of the device. And if I do so, the mat is a nice addition there so that nothing gets scratched. All right, so I think that was it for the QPOINT. If you have any questions, please go ahead and post them in the comments below. All right, and I'll be happy to answer them as time permits. Let's move over to the QSOURCE. Okay, so here I have two QSOURCEs. They're the same, one's just flipped over, so it's easier for you to see how this works. All right, so the QSOURCE is a linear power supply. How does that differ from a traditional power supply? So a traditional power supply is like this one. This is a switched mode power supply. Switched mode power supplies are shipped with pretty much everything that you can buy these days, right? So why? Because they are convenient, they're small, they're inexpensive, and they're very efficient. But there's a price to pay for that, and the price is usually a lot of noise, especially in the high frequencies. So the linear power supply is a little bit the opposite of all of that. So when you go into a linear power supply, you have a transformer, so that makes the device bulkier, so it's heavier, larger. It's also not as inexpensive, and it's also not as efficient. But you gain that very dark, very black background, which is usually what we're looking for all the detail, presentation, separation between the instruments, and all that, right? So let's get into a little bit more detail on how these, on what's available on the QSOURCE as options. So you can see here that there are actually 6 outputs, which is not usual for this kind of device in the market. So the first 4 over here, the four towards the center, so these 4, hopefully you can see here they're marked as 5V, 5 volts. So these are fixed outputs. And you can hook up to 4 of the Q points to these outputs. Okay, so the device takes care of up to 4 Q points at a time. Then you also have the A and B outputs here in the front. These are variable. So by flipping switches on the underside of the device over here, you can select between different voltages. So for example, the A output can be switched between 9, 12, and 19 volts. And the B output can be switched between 12, 19, and 24 volts. So you can actually use the QSOURCE through these outputs over here to power other devices, like for example NAS drives, phonostages, DC phonostages, DC DACs, music servers, and all of these devices. I'm using it, for example, here to power my Roon music server. Okay, so a few other facts about the QSOURCE. You can see over here, it's upside down, but let me just flip it over. You can see that it has a 110-220 switch. When you get your unit, this will be covered. So make sure that you set, it should be set to your region, but it will have a little notice here for you to make sure that you set your region correctly before turning it up. We also get a lot of questions about this binding post over here. This is a ground binding post. And should it be grounded always? Well, that depends. If you already use one of our Q-bases and our Q-core grounding system, then you should not run an additional cable through that, because you're already grounding the QSOURCE through the power cord. However, if you're using this as a standalone unit, then you can ground it via that binding post. All right. Another interesting fact about the QSOURCE is that it is completely silent. It's fanless. Okay, it's convection cooled. You can see the vents over here on the bottom and the vents over here on the top. You can also notice the feet. They're higher than usual. So that means that these vents need to be unobstructed at all times, right? It's all in the manual. Just wanted to mention that. We also have here a pair of DC cables that you can use with the QSOURCE. So this is the standard DC cable, and this is the premium DC cable. They're both solid core, monofilament, twisted pair DC cables. The only difference is the gauge, right? This is a heavier gauge, and it sounds great. Okay, they're also available in 3 different terminations. You can see 2 of them over here. You can see the LEMO, traditional LEMO connector over here, and on this side there's the barrel, the DC barrel connector. Okay, this is a 2.5 model, but you can also order that in a 2.1. One last thing that I wanted to mention about the QSOURCE and the QPOINT. The QPOINT in particular is a very universal product. That means that you can use it with anything. You don't have to have any Nordost gear with it. Okay, it can be paired with pretty much any electronics that you have. And so is the QSOURCE. And the QSOURCE is not, like I said, it has 4 outputs that were specifically designed for the QPOINTs, but you can use it to power other DC devices like DC DACs, phonosages, NAS drives, and so on, switches, and so on and so forth.